Hi, welcome to Tux TV.
Hello.
I'm your host, Jimmy Tux, and I have on the program Dale from Real Seekers. He's got a YouTube channel. He's got just over 1,000 subscribers, and I recently saw him on with a interview about kind of almost more agreement than disagreement over kind of the evils and not so evils about Christianity. And
Okay. Which I thought you
it
like
was reason,
Reason to Doubt with
reason to
Jordan.
doubt. Yeah,
Yeah.
with Jared and it was fascinating. There was a comment exchanged, and that's how we got to here. Reached
Here
out
we
to
are.
him after he made a little bit of a novella. I see you've got your sunglasses on. I feel
I
like I
do.
should mirror my. I should mirror my.
There you go.
I
Yeah,
have.
I'm kind of
I
famous for the sunglasses. So
I have bifocals, so I have
awesome, awesome.
prescriptions.
Now you're jamming. Now you've
Yeah.
got style. If you want to know what it really was, it was just those Christian thug life videos. I was like, yeah, I got to look cool like that.
Yeah, to complement my alter ego and persona, I also sometimes put up my hoodie
Nice.
so that I match my there we go.
Your sunglasses persona there. So
There we go. Now I look like the Unabomber.
there you go. Perfect.
So, uh and go ahead and tell everyone a little bit about yourself, about your channel, and then we'll just
Yeah.
kind
So
of go from there. We're just going to have a brief conversation today, just
yeah.
kind of go over some of the facts of life and biblical issues that we kind of disagree on. So
Awesome. Awesome.
go ahead.
Yes.
The floor is yours, Dale.
All right. Cool. So yeah, my name is Dale. I'm the host of what's called Real Seeker Ministries. So basically on my podcast, I'll do solo shows or sometimes have interviews with Christian and atheist scholars and stuff like that. Or I'll collaborate with friends and stuff, and we'll do shows on various topics. I think related to the philosophy of religion, or everything, theology, biblical studies, whatever it is we're studying. And I'm kind of famously known for my Shroud Wars series. So I'm a Shroudie, or a proponent of the Shroud of Turin, as one of the reasons why I'm a Christian now. I think Christianity is true. So I have my Shroud Wars series where I bring on the Shroud experts on both sides, skeptics and for, and we debate out the various evidences for and against and stuff like that. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. I was also for a time the host of the Faith Unaltered podcast. I've stepped down from being the host on that just because I was doing like 4 to 5 shows a week, and that's way too much. But I'm still associated with the Faith Unaltered thing as a guest host or guest sometimes. So yeah, check out that channel as well. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Well, I guess I'm now hosting Tux TV. So yeah, I think he stepped out for a minute. Oh,
I I forgot. I forgot I put you full screen and I just jumped in and started talking. I forgot that I needed to jump back
I was like, "Jesus, is there a test to buy the new host here?"
in. Congratulations.
Yep, there you go. So just tell your audience, convert to Christianity. There you go.
Yeah, there you go. We got the facts and evidence. Thanks, Dale. So, do you have a PowerPoint or anything that you want to present, or just a quick?
No, just
No,
winging it
just
on
winging
the
it.
show.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna dive into. I'm gonna show your channel here as. Let me. Well, I was going to do this channel instead. So this is Dale's channel right here, Real Seekers. He's got just over 1,000 subs. He's got 351 videos. He's got both videos and he does live content.
Mhm.
And I watched a couple. There was pretty good stuff. He recommended a Dr. Ali Shabali.
Shabir Ali, he's a famous Islamic apologist. So yeah.
I did watch that. It looks like you were on with Doug. and I rewatched some of that. But I'll be honest, as soon as you start talking the Shroud, my brain just kind of shuts off.
With McLennan, was that the one you were talking about?
I do like Dan McLennan. I did not watch that one. Doug with Pine Creek.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an interesting time for sure. He's got, he's got his polemical style, but I asked to be on his show, so I had a fun time regardless, kind of thing, and just
Yeah.
kind of talking to him. The Shroud was a big part. I don't know if you noticed because you said you stopped, but even he had to admit after I left, he was kind of mocking the fact, oh, that there's real blood on the Shroud. And then he on his own show looked it up afterwards. He's like, oh, darn it, the peer reviewed, there is blood on the thing. So I don't know. That was a funny point, but yeah.
Yeah. I have subscribed for a while to Reuters.
Okay.
And Reuters has probably had about 5 articles in the last 10 years or less. Since 2015, there was a big stir about 2015 about the Shroud. And in my conclusion of what Reuters has said, it's some variation of there's 3 shrouds confirmed from the first century that scientists are more closely interested in, and that's kind of the way I've left it until Reuters says that, hey, we found conclusive that it isn't from a forgery from the 12th and 13th century, then so on and so on. If I remember correctly, there was also something about that the Pope found the person who manufactured it, if I remember correctly as well.
Oh, okay. So yeah, what you're talking about with the last thing there is it's a memorandum written by a guy named Bishop Pierre Darcy. So he was a bishop of a place called Troyes about 40 years in around 1389. And he writes a memo saying, well, about 40 years ago or 34 years ago, my predecessor conducted investigation into the church that was showing the Shroud allegedly for the first time in history, according to the skeptics. And he says that during that inquiry, an artist confessed and that sort of thing to having created the Shroud. So that's what you're referring to there. But the majority of historians reject this as evidence on multiple grounds. If you want me to get into that, that's up to you. But did you want me to?
Not really. The last thing in this world I want to talk about is the Shroud.
Okay, cool.
I feel like I've heard plenty of it from what's his name? Otangelo. Otangelo, thank you. Mm-hmm. I've heard more than enough of it from Otangelo, and it just my brain just goes on. This is ridiculous. I've got better things to do. So let's go with the task at hand, because basically there were two main spots in the Reason to Doubt moments that Bayesian came up. There was one at the beginning, and then there was one towards the end. And I had made a comment that I'm going to show this tab right here. Let me see if I can enlarge this. That I accept the theorem, I'd accept Bayes' theorem more often from the Christian if, and this is a big if, they include a higher degree of forethought that the Bible is a human-made deception and or natural-made deception. And you had commented, which I put into audio form. Hopefully it's been uploaded since. I think so. That your reply. So I was just going to go, instead of writing back a novella, it can be read out in about 2 minutes, and then we can just kind of go by part. But one thing I wanted before, as a precursor, so I'm not poisoning the well or anything, let me understand. You had a statistic of your belief in Christianity as 53.14%, which is very 50 more than pi like. And but you had, if I understood correctly, a 95% Bayesian theorem that Christianity has a lot of flaws. or some variation of you list 4 things in the
Positive.
writing. What are the explain that 95% a little more?
Okay. So the first thing I do want to make clear, because skeptics will scold me if I don't make this clear. So even though 53.14%, it sounds very precise and that sort of thing. So I do want to make clear that my use of Bayes' theorem, I'm not talking about statistical probabilities that would be published in a peer-reviewed math journal. I'm just talking about my subjective credence levels for a given piece of evidence or something, right? And then once I assign that, so I split the evidences up into positive evidences, ones that count in favor of the hypothesis that Christianity is true, for example, and then negative evidences, ones that count against the hypothesis. So on the negative evidence side, this is where the 95% came in, because I was saying there was 4 categories of negative evidences. So there were preservation problems, lower textual criticism, inerrancy issues. Does this inspired text have errors in it? And that kind of makes it, if so, that makes it seem like it's not inspired by God or it's a false religion. Moral mistakes that I said. So, things that make God seem immoral. And then finally, the human factor, which I think might relate to things like about you thinking there's human deception. Basically, anything that makes it look petty or like, human beings on their own made this. It's has nothing to do with a god or something like that. So those were the 4 factors. And before I even looked at the positive evidences, I assessed that as a worst case scenario at the 95% level. So that translated, that meant there is only a 5% probability that Christianity was true, before I looked at the positive evidences. And obviously, those raised it to the point where it went over 50 in the end.
Hmm.
Does that make sense? Or
It does. I guess so. The 5% is a strong enough measure. The 5% that you do believe is solid foundation, for instance, that's enough to push you into the category that Christianity is the right thing. There is a God, and he says Christianity, or you believe, you feel that Christianity is the true source of the
absolutely not.
spirituality that you're experiencing.
No, 5% is a dismal failure. So for me, I disbelieve something. I'm a strict evidentialist, in epistemology. So anything 49% to 0%, I disbelieve it. I would not be a Christian if I just had the 5%.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm saying is, so I had 5% just considering the negative evidences alone. But once I factored in the positive evidences and plugged those into Bayes, that raised it to where it was 53.14. And okay, more than 50 means it's more probable than not. So I believed at that point. Make sense?
So what about somebody like myself who believes 0% of the Bible is from a supernatural being, that the God-breathed part of this is merely made up by humans, and there's 0 supernatural beings?
So what I would say when you say 0%, obviously you're talking about, well, that you believe that there's 0% supernatural beings and or that 0% of the Bible is inspired by God. But what I would want to know for Bayes purposes is what subjective percent level of warrant or justification do you have for thinking that those things don't exist? Are you saying that you are absolutely certain and warranted in saying these things don't exist, or the Bible? So it's impossible that Christianity could be true, and given the evidence in your mind?
In my mind, there is 0 evidence that is considered foundational to Christianity, either from historical sources, secular sources, and biblical sources, that it's not a construction or an evolution of other religions, other types of enslavement of the mind type of that it's storytelling, a good combination of storytelling, pagan religions, Hellenistic philosophies, apocalyptic preachers gone, Lord of the Flies
Mhm.
style, and all of it's human, 100%. So to say that there is an evidence that I point to and I just go, I'm still questioning this one. Because once upon a time, not that long ago, I did believe that there were supernatural beings. And I did believe that there are influences in the Bible that can be attributed to an evil character like the devil Satan character,
Okay.
and that evil Satan devil character is recruiting Jesus and was successful at recruiting Jesus, and that everybody is under a delusion that they're worshiping the good guy when it's actually the bad guy of the story, and they're almost two sides, two different sides of the same card, so to speak.
Okay. Okay. So there is some, just in terms of Bayes, just as the starting point, I would want to
Mhm.
clarify something from you, because
Sure.
the first thing that you said is that you said, look, there's a lack of, there's 0% evidence that Christianity is true. And okay, so let me grant that for the sake of argument. Evidence of absence is not um, absence of evidence, or vice versa, however you say that. That saying, right? So
That's correct.
it also seems like you are making a claim on your end that you're saying, well, look, not only that, I can prove Christianity's false because of certain factors. So are you in fact making a claim where you have the burden of proof that you can prove it's false because of some of these things as well?
I believe I can prove that 100% of the Bible and the spirituality of the Bible is human created, that there is zero supernatural being required for any of it to occur. So to say that Christianity is true, I can accept that Christianity is true because obviously there's Christianity right now. Obviously, you are a firm believer in that Christianity.
Mhm.
Now, I would love to see the foundational marks. Like we know in Matthew 7 that there is advice in the Sermon on the Mount that you're supposed to do things on a good solid foundation. Now, to use this as an example, that's the end of the sermon. If if a journeyman, if I contracted a journeyman to build me a house, what's the first thing he's going to do? He's going to build a foundation.
Mhm.
What's the last thing that Jesus does? Oh, by the way, there's a foundation. You need to have a good strong one. He built this beautiful house, he forgot the foundation, he slides it underneath.
Mhm.
Just to use the Sermon on the Mount as an example. It's almost like it's in reverse. They sold the sizzle. They said, hey, you're going to have a really nice roof over your head. Well, that's nice, but you forgot the foundation until the very end. And just to use an example, that is a human type of salesmanship, sizzlemanship,
Mhm.
that doesn't occur, in my opinion, from somebody who's a journeyman who's boring and says, "Oh, first I'm going to grate the land, and then I'm going to pour a foundation,
And just so I'm clear,
et cetera, et
what's
cetera."
what's the foundation here? The Bible, right? Like, because that was
The
written by.
Bible and Christianity does not have a good firm foundation. They kind of slid it in somewhere in the second or third century instead of having a good solid foundation. It wasn't until um, Eusebius kind of said was told to let's get this chaos under control, that we kind of have the information that we have.
Okay. Okay. So if I'm understanding here's your reason for thinking Christianity is probably false, and you give it in the 100% degree. So number one, it's because look, Jesus, if he is this religious founder, he employed this human factor, this human salesman thing that a divine being shouldn't. And you gave as your evidence that the Bible didn't come in until the second or third century, and then I'm not sure what you mean by Christianity came in with Eusebius, but let's just start with the Bible thing, because
The
most people
foundation didn't occur until basically Eusebius.
foundate what. Can you
So,
just
for instance, how do we have canon the way we have canon? When did that start? That process started somewhere in the early 4th century. And there
okay.
was an orchestration of let's get this on, you know,
So,
some
so
form of foundation. That foundation to me really doesn't exist until the Romans got involved.
okay, yeah, I would agree. Having done debates with Orthodox guys, that the issue of the canonicity was not settled until centuries after the fact.
Hmm.
I might question though. Well, how is that foundation? I'm not sure that the issue of the canon is foundation, and this was my argument: is that
Hmm.
because Christian God at all times provided what was sufficient for those believers at those times, right? So, for example, let's take something that would be uncontroversial. In year 55 AD, the Corinthians didn't have to know anything about the canon of Scripture. They, as long as they knew, well, look, I've got this one letter or two letters from Paul, and these are inspired, and that's all. That was sufficient for God's
Hmm.
purposes at that time. That's all they needed to know. Um,
Is there, for instance, um, let's say it's 55 AD.
okay.
You're God, you're the Son of God, and you need Paul to do that for you in 50 something, maybe even 30 something, when Jesus was here and could have done it himself with the clarity and the gravitas. Would that be considered, if you juxtaposition those two that you've mentioned, the 55, and I'm mentioning, say, the 30 to 35, right?
Mhm.
Jesus on one hand did it. Here's the clarity, here's the gravitas. This is exactly what I want you to know. And I'll see you soon. And juxtaposition that with Paul's letters. You have his writing it down only, either for church building or, hey, he's coming soon because this generation is starting to pass,
Mhm.
right? Would you juxtaposition those two and say, this is a really good, strong foundation versus this is what we have, and I'm considering a good, solid foundation because I believe in it?
I think so. I think I would agree that the later added bits of foundation, as we're defining it here, is better. Is better probably, right? Because I think there's a reason they needed writings. Now the question is though, if you're accepting this principle that what they had in 55 was good enough for them, we can also backtrack that to 30 and 35 AD with, okay, well, what Jesus provided as oral traditions to those people that he spoke to, was that sufficient for them at that time? And there wasn't a need for Paul's letter until 55 AD. So I think I would come back in that same kind of counter response and say, well, yeah, the oral tradition Jesus delivered in 30 AD was sufficient. Or if it wasn't, can, like, on what basis would you argue it wasn't? Because, okay.
So, like, going back to that juxtaposition, you have, if you have a half god or full god, depending on, if you have a supernatural being begotten
Mhm.
to a human being, and he has all this wealth of information, and it doesn't mirror anything that occurred before, and it's definitely coming from God, is it the best possible avenue that to be given to us directly? And to me, you have history repeating itself. For instance,
Mhm.
let's go back to Genesis 1. You've watched my video kind of going over the deception, how the deception starts.
Mhm.
If God gives an instruction and then creates another person, but we don't know who told Eve, because God does not give the directions directly to Eve in the Bible. He God may do that
Mhm.
according to the Bible, but it's not listed. The information could be secondhand. It could be from any talking thing in the Garden of Eden, assuming that only humans were talking or other things are talking. The information could be available. I've also heard from the rabbis that there is another story, and I'm not sure if it's from other Jewish works, but that Adam and Eve were actually one being, and God just separated them as a result. So Eve may have been present at the time, but according to Genesis 2 and the information I have available, God does not reiterate the rules to Eve directly. And the first person that gets deceived is the first person who does not directly receive the clarity and gravitas that a creator being would give. It's the same thing with Jesus being here. We're getting all the secondhand information, and that leaves a valley-wide avenue for deception. To just walk right down for Christians right now to have understood something to be true, but they got it secondhand, third hand, fourth hand, oral history. Some variation of it gets written down 20-ish years later. Stories that evolve from that and continue on. Stories then get supplemented to explain the story that was originally there, much like the similarity between Star Wars coming out in 1977 and Rogue One coming out in 2015 or 16, whenever it came out. So you have a story, and then somebody really loves that story, and then a supplement story comes out that fills in some gaps. And I think you see a lot of that in the New Testament. People loved this story. It was a modern interpretation of both the religions that they loved, the philosophical thoughts that they loved, and the I kind of forgot what I was saying, but kind of a modern contemporary version of both Hebrew, maybe even some of the works according to James Tabor, not James Tabor,
Crossley.
No, the Homer's Iliad. Is it Tabor? No, it's MacDonald.
Okay.
MacDonald showing that there's kind of juxtapositions between Homer's works and the Gospel of Mark. For instance, Mark also mirroring the Elijah-Elisha story, Matthew mirroring the Moses story. You see apocalyptic preachers clearly having an incentive of knowing what the past history was and trying to cater these new Roman invaders to kind of work out the contrast between these invaders are too hardy for us to defeat, so we have to prepare for the long game. The pen is mightier than the sword.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I think that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does answer my question as to where you're coming from and that sort of thing. Obviously, it would be on me to defend then and try to come up with a defeater against this. And at the very least, my goal with you, because you're saying you've got absolute certainty on this basis that God did not inspire it, I would try to aim for try to get in a possibility at least for you then to say, well, maybe it is possibly true despite these things. So the first
you think it's God inspired?
I do, definitely. Yeah.
So to counter my claim that it is clearly a human made document. Mm-hmm. No God breathed necessary. What would you suggest? What's our in between, or if you choose, what's your best evidence that it is, since Jesus didn't write it himself, and I'm unsatisfied with, basically, I want that as my foundation. That's what I want. Jesus to do it himself. I don't need Paul. I think Paul's a huckster, and I think he admits as much.
Okay. So
for instance.
Okay, so putting aside Paul being a huckster, that's a third issue. But okay, this issue of the confluency of Scripture, right? It is a obvious proven fact that, look, unlike what Muslims claim with the Quran, a dictation model of the biblical inspiration is not true. There are provable humans wrote this book type thing. That is, I think, an undeniable fact, and this is what Christians call the confluency of Scripture. So your kind of question is, God, you're kind of saying God wouldn't do that. That's not the best way to go about giving mankind your inspired message and stuff like that. And this is where I would kind of push back and say, well, I'm not sure about that, because remember, God's goal isn't just about revealing a set of propositions. That's part of it, but that's not the total goal. It's about, in the end, saving as many free will souls as possible over all of time. And I think a necessary part of that process is you do have to get humans participating in, because by their doing stuff and participating in this salvific history, that helps to develop our characters whereby they'll be fit for salvation. So I would argue that it's, at least for your standards, it's at least possible, isn't it, that maybe it's better the way God did, because that better accomplishes his end goal, rather than just the goal of, let me just reveal these propositions, which I think I would agree with you. If that was just his goal, then the dictation model would be better.
Mm-hmm. So is there, if I ask for the alibi from the 8 supernatural entities that exist in the Holy Book that I don't have any evidence for, and we juxtaposition between your dictation request from God, or my dictation request for God, versus a God breathed in, how did you put it, spiritually influenced or something like that?
Or yeah,
Uh,
like in terms of how inspiration
yeah,
works.
inspiration. Yeah. So divine inspiration versus a foundational, this is written in stone. We know it's from God. It's protected by miracle. We've tried to blow the crap out of this thing and it just doesn't work, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
If we have that kind of model versus the juxtaposition of, we have this God breathed word, it was oral history, then it was written down when those folks who thought that they were going to be in the generation that Jesus came back and brought up, but they weren't. So we wrote this down. A couple of years later, the story had morphed. It may be even legendized. It may be even had some influence from outside deceivers. And there's warnings of such in this holy book as a result, for instance. So if you juxtaposition those two, which one do you think deception would thrive in? If we have the God dictated version versus what we have now that warns us of such evils and deception. The book of Jude says we've already been infiltrated, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's just obvious. You have to be honest here that obviously the dictation and then subsequent supernatural preservation of that, as though it's written on stone,
Mm-hmm.
would be better at preventing deception, because it would be impossible for any deception to creep in. So, on
Yeah.
the face of it, that would be better in that respect, right? In terms of preserving those propositions, it's questionable to me whether it would be better for the end goal of saving as many free will souls as possible. And that's what I'm trying to open you up to, that possibility that maybe, all things considered, given God's actual end times goal, his ultimate goal, let's say, it was actually better to allow this. Now, that's a separate question from, okay, but is he also allowing in errors as well? So that would be another tricky thing that you would have to factor in. Like, it's one thing if he let humans write it, but it was totally inerrant,
Yeah.
then it wouldn't suffer from that. But yeah, now you're adding in this extra layer of, it's not just that it's a human writing, but there's also errors in there.
And that's the thing. There's no supernatural being, when there is an error made, that comes and corrects it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, obviously it's a debate as to whether, look at all these cool cats. Yep, the sunglasses. There you
Yeah.
go. Um,
Yeah. We almost got the staticky glasses just for you, Gur.
oh, Gurman, I remember Gur. Yeah, so obviously it's going to be debatable. I think that I'm agnostic on the question of biblical inerrancy myself.
Yeah.
I used to disbelieve it, because I used to think I used to think that the Bible does teach young earth creationism, and it does teach that there was a global flood. And these are, in fact, very probably errors, just based on the scientific evidence. Now, in terms of the errors, let's assume that there are errors just for the sake of argument, because this was something that I was struggling with when I left the faith kind of thing about 13 years ago. And it was Gary Habermas who kind of helped me work this out. And he first put to me this question of, okay, even if there are errors, so what? How does that falsify Christianity in and of itself? And I kind of took that seriously. Like, it just sounded obvious to me that obviously an inspired God, it would have to be perfect, and that anything he inspired would have to be perfect and subsequently preserved in perfection. But the more I realized it and thought about it, I put it in the context of, again, what is God's ultimate goal? The purpose of revelation is to save as many free will souls as possible. And on that front, we can evaluate the significance of the errors. So, in order to achieve God's end goal, there can't be any essential errors. Like, for example, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, I mean, the Bible even tells us Christianity's out of the water. It's 100% that disproves Christianity. Same with, I think, if we could prove Jesus wasn't divine somehow, I think that's an essential belief, 100%. But there are other things. Okay, let's say that Calvinism is true, and I find that to be a moral mistake. I think that it's possible. I allow for the possibility or reasonable doubt that that could be an error in the Bible, and yet still this is God's inspired thing. I would say I'm 95% certain that if that's the case, if there is an error on that front, Christianity is probably false. But I still say it's still possible he could achieve his goal even with that kind of level of error. And on the other end, there are errors in the Bible about like the number of horses. Well, that I don't think that interferes with his goal much at all. At most, maybe 55% you could argue or something. It's very insignificant in terms of him not achieving his end goal and therefore falsifying Christianity. So that's how I kind of assess if there are errors in the Bible. I would assess it in terms of the significance of creating what I call undue confusion, hindering God from achieving that ultimate purpose. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? Or
I think so. I mean, basically, to kind of pick and choose a couple of things that you'd said. One thing that struck me as odd is that the ability for a supernatural being, in my mind, to make something that doesn't have deception in it should be easy. Mm-hmm. Should be absolutely easy.
Yeah.
And we don't see that. And that changes the landscape. The minute that you introduce that there's a supernatural evil being, that Jesus is accused of being in cahoots with supernatural deities multiple times, is accused of being one himself or being possessed by one, being recruited by one. And keep in mind, something that you had mentioned that always strikes me as odd is God is the creator. We have all these stories about how great God is. God is kind of a murderer, mass murderer, kind of an evil, maniacal gambler, so to speak. And, various punishments to these Israelites. And then we have Jesus. And that opens the door to all of us, right? Now, if Jesus is actually on the bad guy side, would we see the juxtaposition, once again, of a good God sent his son, fix the problem? Do we see that? No. We see the guy disappear. We have this kind of New Testament, and it's not going to be fixed, as far as I can tell, until the false prophet is thrown into a lake of fire, or some variation of that towards the end in Revelation 20, right? So we don't see that the problem is fixed. It's going to be fixed someday. And once again, I juxtaposition between a good God and his own dictation, and juxtaposition what we have someday. Does option A on this juxtaposition, what we have, look like a deceiver may have done it, so that someday you get that promise? And I refer to it a lot of times as we've been mentally prepared to love our Nigerian prince scam.
Mhm. Well, I think so. Starting with the last issue first, I think that the first thing we have to do, we have to characterize what the Bible is saying properly, right? Like, what
Mm-hmm.
is it analogous to this Nigerian scam or not? So in the first place, you're kind of taking literally God's son is like his literal offspring. He's a totally separate being. So
Mm-hmm.
obviously Christians believe in the Trinity. So that Jesus is God. He is a necessary and essential part of the being that is God, right? And so on that front, all three of them, including God, Jesus himself, as one third of the Trinity, agreed to sacrifice himself. Now, surely, I think you would agree in the first place that there are times, at least on a human level, where it is appropriate and indeed, if not morally ideal, it's at least morally permissible for people to sacrifice their lives for the sake of others. Picture a firefighter who tries to save people and he dies. So, is it at least that's a principle that we could agree on, that there are times in some circumstances where it's appropriate for one person to sacrifice their lives on behalf of others.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now it comes down to the question, well, why would it be appropriate for God? Obviously, if he's omnipotent, he could find different ways to accomplish that goal without having to sacrifice himself, right? The only reason that works with a firefighter is because he's got limited options. He's a finite being or something.
Yeah.
So my answer on that front is that no, God is just as limited as the firefighter. And the reason is because in order to achieve that end goal, humans have to participate. A necessary component is we have to make a free will choice to meet certain conditions, right? And without our free will, our voluntarily participating in that, the goal's done. God can't do it on his own. So I argue that it's a necessary consequence of having this sin disease since the fall.
Mm-hmm.
The only way to get rid of that is you have to die, both spiritually and physically, as a consequence of that. There's no choice on God's part. It's not like, okay, well, in order to get rid of the sin problem of humanity, you can either die, Jesus, or you can eat an orange, and either way, it'll get rid of it. No, there's no choice. The only way to deal with it and atone for sins is you have to die. So in that case, Jesus is like, I'm going to take it on their behalf. I'm going to do that and apply the consequences of that punishment to them by dwelling in their hearts. And that's how he reforms our characters, what we call sanctification. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, I think our buddy S.A. Supra has basically made the similar point, but is stating emphatically that it isn't being a hero if you start the fire to go in to save somebody. Yeah. It's just and that is what we see in the Bible. We see an invisible hero, an invisible boogeyman to go back and forth and duke it out and pound it out, just like the old Warner Brothers cartoon, Morning Sam, Morning Ralph, and the sheepdog and the wolf. Wolf are just pounding it out all day long. Punch the clock, go home, have dinner together, and they're buddies on the outside of the 9 to 5,
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost like you think God has rolled up his sleeves and he punches the clock and he goes to town on these humans all day long, protecting them from the devil, and yet it's really just his buddy, and they're just yucking it up, and it's almost a human evolution story of that. It just started from somebody else's civilization, in my opinion, and you have influences coming in, and you see an evolution of that. Somebody like myself, who I feel I've had the equivalency of a vision, like Paul did, and opened my eyes to how the scam is hidden within the words. Because the same book that everybody worships from is also the same book that the leader of these seed faith programs, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, even Orthodox, they see, in my opinion, a cash machine for every man, woman, and child who is committed. And that's what I see. This is the broader picture when you zoom out. So when you when you want to suggest that the hero is there, and that if it's just for saving souls, the equivalency of the firemen set the fire to be the hero to run in and dash out the flames and save everybody before they perish.
Yeah, this is a great, a fantastic point, and you're absolutely right. I mean, by the very act of, okay, look, if this is, when I say it's necessary, I mean it's factually necessary. Given God chose to create a universe with finite creatures like yourselves with free will, then it's necessary that he has to go through this process, because we will just always choose to sin. But guess what? God, as a Christian, I don't believe that creation itself is logically necessary. God could have not created and just existed on his own. So that's the equivalent, by him creating, that's the equivalent of him setting the fire. So this is a great point. And the way I respond to that level of criticism, this is what I actually wrote my master's thesis on. I think only a good God could create. An evil God, it's impossible for them to create. But the way I would address this is that it comes down to, I'm not a utilitarian, but I use the word utility because it's the only word I know how to make sense of what I'm trying to say. But so there's the world where God only exists without creating. Let's say this has a level of 10 utility points or something like that, right? That's the maximum best possible world. I also argue that, so Real Seekers is my YouTube name, just so James knows. The actual world that we exist is one of the two best possible worlds. So one best possible world is where God exists without creation. And then there's this world. And the reason why this also has a utility value of 10, meaning both worlds are equally valuable. And that's why God can have a choice, and either choice he makes is equally good. But it's because there are certain benefits that happen when God creates that he can't get by himself, right? So for example, having that salvific relationship with, he's in a relationship with 3 people. Well, if you have 100, that's better. If you have 5,000, that's better. So there are certain benefits he gets to creating. But there's also those costs that come in, people that don't choose to and go to hell. So my thesis is that those balance out to where it has the same overall utility as the world where God just doesn't create, and therefore he has a free choice to create or not. And it's actually a good thing that he creates, because even though it doesn't add any other value, this is showing his other centeredness. Why on God's green earth would he create then? And his reason is purely other centered. I'm creating for you. It's good for you. It doesn't add any overall value. I'm just as good without you, but it's good for you personally to experience these things. So I'm creating for your benefit. So that's why that's the rationale behind God's choice of starting that fire, despite the fact that it doesn't make a difference in the overall value. Evil gods. Okay.
Oh, you want me to put that back up?
Oh.
Can you see the chat in the studio?
Yeah, I don't know. Evil gods with inabilities seem to be a special
Anti-pleading.
What is anti-pleading?
I think it's I think it's the contrast between my God is really amazing. Well, what's the difference between a God and a false God? Well, for instance, I'd reference the the house divided by itself shall not stand. Basically, reference of you are accused of being in cahoots with an evil God, and instead of answering the question, you instead answer with a question. And you don't really say, well, I'm Jesus, the anti-pleading God type of thing. At least that's kind of the way I take it. Maybe Nitty has another explanation.
Yeah, I think he's referring to, like, because I made a comment, off the cuff comment, that only a good God could make this choice. An evil God, by definition, couldn't create. And this was actually the subject of my master's thesis, which is for
So
free on
was
my
that
book.
the 11 point? Because I did read through that, and I
No,
listened to
this
the 3 hour podcast you did with a gent that had an eye patch.
David
I don't remember
Johnson,
his name. David Johnson. Thank you.
from
Um,
Skeptics.
he was very cordial with your thought processes. I just the way I did the audio for when we do the comment here,
Mhm.
just the same way that I did the audio that way. I also listened to that thesis off your website, downloaded the PDF, and listened to the entirety. It's interesting stuff, but to me, once again, if the foundation isn't there, then much of what you're saying has a struggle to climb up that hill. In my opinion, if
Yeah.
there's no God, then all of it's for nothing. If there is a God, well, I can certainly follow along because I've had the image of the God that I believed existed, and then I realized that I think I've been duped, and so I looked, and I didn't find God. I found human beings telling stories, and very successfully telling stories, and profiting from those stories.
Mhm.
And to me, the equivalent of modern day is George Lucas. He's a storyteller. He started telling stories in the late 60s and early 70s, and then he had the biggest success of anybody in my life. And you see how it has morphed and merged with other stories sometimes,
Mhm.
and taken influences. Things have taken influences from that, and it evolves again.
Yeah. So I totally hear you, and I would agree. You're talking about my 11 premise argument, which is
The 11
different.
premise are, yeah.
That so Nitty was asking about something else, the evil
Let's
God
see.
challenge. But
That's good.
so with I totally agree. Look,
Can you see the screen?
people make statements, right? Statements are just assertions that are either true or false in and of themselves, right? But then you can ask the further question. So that my 11 premise argument, the way it is on the website, again in the rough format, is just a series of statements. It's an argument in standard form. But then you have the further question of, okay, well, is this an actual argument? Are these series of statements serving as good premises that you can infer the conclusion? In other words, is it a valid argument? And are the premises sound or deductively strong, as Richard Feldman says? Do we have evidence or good reason to think these things are probably true? And yeah, that's a separate question. I think I do have good reasons for thinking, the foundation of premise one, God exists. I've got reasons for that and stuff. So that's where you have to get into the evidence for and against the truth of that hypothesis of that premise there, and evaluate the overall thing. My belief in God, given the evidence, is very strong. One of the reasons for that on the objective end is the modal ontological argument. Um, so Nitty's, in terms of my evil God challenge thesis, just search evil God and then, look at the couple blogs and you'll see an attachment with my entire thesis for free. I also include my supervisor and second reader who give criticism of where I was good, where I sucked and stuff. So you have professional philosophers to give feedback on that. So yeah, that's on my blog.
Here we go. This is there's the comment of the day right there. Thank you, Nitty.
You know what? Faith Unaltered, because they make money. They offered to buy me one, and I was just like, well, this is good enough. What's wrong? I don't know.
Yeah,
I've never been fussy about quality and
I
stuff.
had to turn off the banner because it cut off your mouth, and anytime there's a long comment, it cuts you off like anything that's this long.
I guess.
Looks
I
like
guess.
I'm,
There you go.
and
But
there was so there's a Christian in the chat,
mhm.
and I like this comment.
Okay.
I marked it. So James, this was at James Apperson. The world belongs to the devil. Our kingdom is not over yet. Be patient.
So
So
Oh, sorry.
That to me, that plays right into my narrative that why have a book in, for instance, in our conversation by email when um your doctor friend
Shabir
Shabali
Ali. Yeah,
Shabali. So, oh, sorry, I have such a hard time for that.
no
I
problem.
mean, his response is direct. Hey, the devil did it, and nobody's providing the alibi for the devil did it. Nobody's providing the counter measure in Luke 4 6. The
Mhm.
devil says he owns this world. This is his. He has all the power, and he gives it to whoever he chooses.
Mhm.
And my question is, why is he choosing Jesus?
Okay. So, one thing, just to respond to that, I would slightly disagree theologically with that, with James the Christian. The kingdom is here, it's just not fully here. So, the Messianic era was initiated at Jesus' death and resurrection, and it's being completed at the end of the age. But that's a theological, technical difference. In terms of your question, so this is a great question. I think you might be misunderstanding or misapplying what I was trying to say and what Shabir Ali was saying. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't that he was saying, well, hey, the Bible was made by Satan. The Bible is just a book with a set of propositions. I was talking about more of those, when I'm talking about positive evidences, what I call religion authenticating miracles. So, for example, I was talking to Shabir about those shroud images, or to get away from the shroud, the historical evidence for the resurrection, from the appearances, empty tomb, that kind of stuff. When I'm trying to make an argument that there is a religion authenticating miracle, okay, well, Shabir Ali is coming in and saying, well, you're assuming that God did it. Like Satan can do these supernatural acts too. So how do you say that, well, yeah, God did this? It's a miracle versus maybe Satan did it or some other, maybe aliens, some other supernatural being, whatever. So that's what he meant by raising the Satan issue. And that's where my 11 premise argument comes in, specifically premise 9, where I'm saying that, well, look, that's impossible because given God has this end goal, God cannot permit or allow any other being, whether supernatural or otherwise, to commit an act that a reasonable real seeker would interpret as a religion authenticating miracle, because that would confuse us. Here I am on this basis. I'm following Christianity. I believe it's true. I believe it's the way to not earn, but to gain my salvation. And if that's all a farce from Satan, then that makes God immoral. That's God's fault that I've fallen for that. And
Well,
if he exists, he can't allow that. And sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, that is an excellent point. And that would mean that Satan, if he orchestrated anything that ended up in that book, for instance, if Satan is real, that would not make God a good God. It would just make God Satan's boss.
Okay, so but that's a separate question. I would just say, like, is it morally permissible for God to create Satan? And again, that's all falling in providentially into his plan and helping to achieve his ultimate goal, right? So
Mhm.
Satan's needed. Again, human free will is a necessary ingredient. So he knows that you need Satan playing his role in order to get to that end goal. If he had created a world without Satan, I mean, that it could have been much worse. Maybe less people would have freely chosen to be saved for one reason or another. When it comes to people's free wills, it's a black box. It's a mystery. People are stupid. I've been stupid at times, and why the heck did I choose to do that? It made no rational sense. So, yeah, I would just kind of come back and say, well, if you just took Satan out of the equation, for all we know, it may have been worse. Less people would have, in the end, freely chose to achieve salvation.
So, something that you had said earlier, and I don't remember exactly how you phrased it,
Mhm.
and I kind of want to weave this story together right here because this kind of goes to Satan cannot do X, and I don't remember what it was, but it was almost in the first 5 minutes of our conversation. Satan is incapable of doing X. Um,
I said that.
I think so. It might not have been Satan, but it might have been a deceiver. But you've just made a statement that God also is incapable of doing this in a deceiving way. And I have to go to Job here. It states that in Matthew, Satan's not able and capable to control factors like the weather.
Mm-hmm.
But in the story of Job, we have the Hasatan character, who's in the celestial council, who is basically having an organized bet with Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And when the challenge is going back and forth, the Satan character is like, okay, you can't, I gotta do something here. And he's like, well, the 10 children, how about I go after the 10 children? The way the 10 children die is by a cause of the weather, which means God can inflict essentially deceiving damage amongst people at the request of Satan. And you have that scenario play out that requires a permission, and that kind of goes to my comment that it is the boss of Satan.
Yeah, so I think so. On one level, I think I would agree, right? Like I didn't say that God can't allow for any confusion or even use deceiving means, right? So there are explicit Bible verses that say God allowed spirits to deceive certain prophets, like with King Ahaz, for example, right? So God does use evil agents such as Nebuchadnezzar and Satan to achieve his ends. And to some extent, he delegates his certain powers and authorities to various people for various reasons, including people who are not good agents or something like that, including Satan, right? Like Satan is said to be the ruler of this world. Well, that had to be delegated by God because only God is sovereign. So he uses Satan to achieve his ends. What I was arguing was a very specific case where, given God has his goal of saving as many souls as possible, he cannot delegate or allow Satan or some other deceiving agent to have that power in a way that would hinder the achievement of God's goal, because that would just mean God would fail as a maximally great being. He would fail to achieve his own goal. That can't happen. So it's on that basis that he has this goal. And if he allowed deceiving in those contexts, then it would prevent the achievement of that goal. That's why I argue it. But I'm not saying that a blanket statement that God can never use deceiving spirits or Satan within his overall providential goal and playing a role. Yeah, Satan is God. God is Satan's puppet. Other way around, whoever that was.
I think well, let's do the audio for the
Okay.
comment, and then let's just kind of dissect that a bit,
Mhm.
and then we'll call it a show. I think we've had a pretty good this flowed pretty nicely for the first hour. Let's see if we can't scrap a good short together
Sounds good.
later.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's been great so far. So, yep, let's do it.
Jimmy, I'm not sure why thinking the Bible is a human-made deception and / or supernatural deception is relevant to this debate, as we were more arguing for specific events, such as ones recorded in the Bible, and whether we are rationally able to infer that they are miraculous in nature or not. On that front, I have considered human-made deception / fraud where appropriate, but I have also put considerable thought into the supernatural deception aspect as well. I remember Dr. Shabir Ali taking me out to Tim Hortons and going over my work on the Shroud of Turin, and he simply said, "Okay, I believe they are supernatural, but Satan did it." That's see where God as a real maximally great being comes in, as he can't allow another supernatural being to defraud or deceive a reasonable real seeker in this way, as that would entail his allowing for undue confusion.
So that's kind of what you were touching on, and that to me, um, that to me is invalidated the moment that you read that someday these false teachers, false prophets, are no longer going to be able to deceive, as it says in Revelation 12:9 and 20:10 specifically.
So sorry, what's your objection? Revelation says that at the end time, when the messianic era comes to completion, false prophets will no longer be able to deceive at all.
The
Um,
devil, the
okay.
devil and his angels and deception, the false teachers, are all going to finally be thrown into a lake of fire. They're finally going to be dealt with.
Yeah, but I don't see that as problematic for what I was saying, because I'm saying in the interim before that point, he needs Satan and these deceiving spirits to play their role, and this is why he allows
Satan cannot.
certain forms of confusion. What we know for certain, or as I argue my 11 premise argument in premise 9 specifically, is that we at least know that God can't allow certain forms of confusion in the here and now, what I call undue confusion. He can allow deceiving spirits to deceive people and confuse them, or false prophets to give false prophecies in the here and now. And that we know from Revelation that will come to an end after they've played their necessary role in bringing about that result of saving as many souls as possible. So I don't see the fact that, okay, well, there's a future day when no more deception, no more confusion of any kind is allowed, that somehow invalidates that God can allow confusion in the here and now temporarily.
Would it suggest potentially that if there is a deceiver in a supernatural nature who is prominent in your holy book, that to use the parable, how much yeast leavens the whole loaf, is there a bad yeast analogy in which the supernatural, being the devil, never really needs anything more than a couple of chapters here and there to contaminate the whole thing?
So okay, so yeah, so that's kind of what I was saying at the beginning of this quote, is that the debate I was doing with Jordan and what Shabir Ali was talking about was, can I was talking about, can Satan be the cause of what we interpret as religion authenticating miracles? And there I'm saying no, because that would be undue confusion, right? That would hinder. I would be believing in a false religion and that sort of thing on that basis, and I wouldn't achieve my ultimate purpose. What you're asking is slightly different. You're saying, well, can't Satan allow for confusion in the biblical text? Like maybe he plugs in a couple extra false chapters just to mix things up a bit. And again, that, I guess it would come down to, do you believe in biblical errancy or something like that? If there are errors in the Bible, even the most minor error that I assigned a low significance to is still a lie, and that comes from Satan. So I would say that yes, I can accommodate. I don't know if it wouldn't be like two chapters, but like I can accommodate Satan inspired errors in the Bible and still believe in Christianity. Again, depending on the significance of that error that we're allowing, in terms of achieving God's end goal. Um, but I do agree with you that the default is, we would expect there it would I think the default would be assume it is inerrant if it comes from God. And why would it requires an explanation, I guess, is what I'm saying. Why on earth would God allow his inspired word to be contaminated by stuff? And then it would be on the theist to provide an explanation as to why that would be the case. So does that answer your question? I think the default, you are
Yeah.
right.
God inspiration to me is a code word that says to me, well, this has been documented much like a modern day legal brief. If it has tightly sealed, no contamination, it went from the CSI unit to collecting the evidence to securing the evidence, the chain of custody is recorded, then yes, your God inerrancy, it seems like it would stand, but it's not. It's oral history. It's written down a few years later. There's warnings. Again, there's warnings of deception at every turn, nearly 2 or 3 dozen times. To me, the capability of the supernatural being in the Luke 4 Matthew narrative, Luke 4 Matthew 4 narrative, is just as capable if he's able to fly up and take Jesus with him and recruit him, then he's fully capable of orchestrating the oral history and influencing it, and the written history and influencing it.
Yeah, yeah. So let me put it this way: I actually do believe, because of the preservation problems. Look, that every biblical scholar, whether they're the most evangelical Christian on earth, they will admit there are scribal errors that have crept into the manuscript tradition and stuff like that. And that, okay, well, for me, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, we have the original Greek and only that was inspired by God, a now lost thing. We don't have the original autographs. And every Christian scholar, if you say, where is this perfectly preserved text in the Greek corpus of the manuscripts? Well, it doesn't exist. There's no single document. It's just they say, well, it's preserved somewhere in the corpus of Greek manuscripts. I don't buy that. No, I don't think that is the way God did it. So I'm kind of stuck on the hook of saying, well, every subsequent the King James version is in the inspired word of God. The NIV is the inspired word of God as well, as these Greek manuscripts and stuff like that. And because of that, I am forced to admit there are some errors in the Bible, because there are scribal errors in the inspired King James version that Mike Lacona would admit, Craig Evans would admit, all biblical scholars would admit. But it just doesn't bother me. I don't think that kind of confusion that God is permitting in any way hinders the achievement of his goal. So it's not undue confusion just because I'm questioning, well, how many horses were in Solomon's stables? I don't know.
It would be an ever-changing number. That reminds me of the joke. Obama said he was 44 last year, and this year he's 45. Which is it? As far as I can tell, horses are doing the naughty all the time and creating more horses, and horses are dying, creating an ever flux in how many horses. So, depending on.
Cool. Well, thank you for defending the Bible. So I guess I'm wrong. It's not an error then. So.
You're off the. Yeah, I was giving you one because you just kind of knocked down your story on a peg, I think. So.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's good. It basically, it's the logical law of non-contradiction. If it reports two contradictory facts at the same time and in the same sense, then it's a contradiction. Also, the King James version is completely inconsistent in translating Trump.
There's the Christian is engaged on pro-Trump Christianity with James Apperson, and it's obviously bleeding. It's obviously bleeding into this as well.
Okay. So this isn't a question so much. It's just
not. Yeah. Yep. Chat's got their own story going on. Christian brings a sword
cool.
He's going to convert me someday. He or she's going to convert me someday, I'm sure.
Sounds good. I'll be praying for this.
Let's go with a little more of the comment here.
Okay.
Perform counterfeit religion authenticating miracles/events that would confuse the reasonable real seeker, else he is no longer really maximally great. Now that said, beyond the question of identifying miracles, on the question of the Bible being human-made or a supernatural deception, I have considered these factors in my overall Bayesian approach to the question of whether Christianity as a whole, i.e., Christianity proper, is true or not, given the Bible is provably sufficiently attached to the truth/falsity of Christianity. These represented the negative evidence.
There is one thing. So this is getting into what we started with in Bayes, in terms of Bayes, but earlier it mentions, I was talking about God can't allow undue confusion in terms of religion authenticating miracles. And I agree with that. But there is the issue that you haven't raised about false prophet. The Bible in the New Testament records that false prophets could also do supernatural acts and use those to deceive things, right? And to going, oh, well, this is a miracle and stuff like that. So I'm kind of differentiating. So, for example, miraculous healings, they wouldn't qualify necessarily as a religion authenticating event. because there are false prophets that do miracles and that sort of thing, do supernatural healing. So I wouldn't use miracle healings as a proof that Christianity is true, because it is obvious that God allows for supernatural healings in other contexts that don't specifically authenticate something. So there's some nuance there that depending on the type of miracle, we have to establish that it is serving to authenticate a religion, and only in that kind of context can we say, well, God can't allow Satan to do it. Okay.
So you would just assume that if there are supernatural beings that in the hierarchy, that the Satan character would be completely incapable of influencing or infiltrating the narrative because it's God inspired. Is that what I understand correctly?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
In terms of the Bible,
would I be able to, let me follow up real quick. Would this correction come from, if there was an infiltration, would the correction come from this good supernatural hero, much like the Adam and Eve story, where the deceiver makes its deceptive case, tells the truth while doing so, and it's not until later that the Yahweh character comes back into the story?
Okay, so you're into the text again, but
Well, maybe not the text so much, but the example of there's no supernatural being that is intervening when somebody's telling the truth, but that truth is deceptive. If this book is considered the truth in the New Testament, the Jesus narrative, but it has the false prophets practicing their craft, it has supernatural beings practicing their craft,
Mhm.
and it's now on display in written form and presented to us as the inerrant word of God, God breathed, God inspired, some variation. If it is indeed contains some deception and no supernatural being comes and remedies it, I'm looking for the alibi that somebody went and verified from God, and we have that inherency and evidence of that inherency as well.
Okay. So I think that, yeah, in this case, God is required to provide certain mechanisms for us to discover those errors, right? So one might be that we can tell because we discover, well, this just directly contradicts something else we know. It contradicts other scriptures, or it contradicts established fact. So we can discover, say, this bit here is from Satan if we've properly understood it and stuff like that, and we've proven that it is in fact an error. Okay, this bit's from Satan. Another thing, like if we're talking about false prophets, right? So forget the text for a second. So, true prophets giving a religious message and the false prophets giving another religious message. Again, I think God would have to provide clarifying mechanisms to understand this guy, not that guy. And one of the examples of doing that is found in the story of Moses versus the Egyptian people. I believe they were performing supernatural feats according to the biblical text. They're not just natural magic tricks. I think the Exodus is saying no, they were doing supernatural stuff through the power of Satan. So this is if God provides a clarifying mechanism through a religious contest, whereby it's clear, look, these guys have supernatural things, but Yahweh is the true God. And so there's this context of a religious contest where there is one clear winner. Yahweh is right, not these pagan Egyptian gods. That could be another exception clause, right? So again, it's God is providing the clarification to prevent any confusion about which religion is authentic. Okay, I'll declare you a false prophet when none of that BS happens. Well, I don't claim to be a prophet, either true or false. So, is he talking about religious contests or just BS?
Well, I interpret that as you're perpetuating what is potentially false prophets. As a Christian, if you've been deceived, you're perpetuating that deception.
Yeah. So that's where I have to rely on my argument that given I know God exists, I know that God can't allow me to be deceived, at least on those matters, kind of thing. On the fact that Christianity is the religion He's wants us to follow to achieve our ultimate purpose. God cannot allow any Satan contamination. As a non just
Is it unreasonable for me to ask for that evidence that God did indeed do that?
No, that is totally reasonable. That's what I myself did, right? And that's where we get into the warrant for each of the premises. Obviously, premise 11 of my argument is where I get into the specifics of those four evidences. There's also a fifth one now that might work. It didn't apply at my conversion, but I have a circumstantial argument based on messianic prophecy. So it's not a direct argument from prophecy, but it's kind of a nuanced thing. But yeah, I would need to get into those five evidences, convince you or persuade you that these are good evidences. We've got reasons. Why is it that God can't let Dale be deceived, but can let billions of others? No, God, I'm not saying me. I'm saying God can't let any reasonable, real seeker experience undue confusion. If you've got proof of what I'm calling a religion authenticating miracle, and my criteria are covered in the debate with Jordan that led to this show, right? What is a religion authenticating miracle? I've got my criteria. He can't allow any event conducive to a false religion fulfill those criteria. And if you are a reasonable real seeker and you experience an event that ticks off all those boxes and it's a false religion, then my whole argument fails. And I argue that God can't allow for that circumstance to happen for any and all reasonable real seekers. It's not just about me, it's about everyone who is a reasonable real seeker.
All right, let's finish this comment then.
Okay.
Evidences I factored in and assessed in Bayes. There were four categories of negative evidence from the Bible that I looked at. I. Inerrancy issues. 2. Moral mistakes. 3. Preservation problems via textual criticism, and I. Human factors. Things that made the Bible seem petty or like it was written by humans alone without any inspiration by God. In coming to my overall conclusion that Christianity is true, 53.14%. This includes.
I love that number. I know you take this number pretty serious, but it seems objective. I find it very hard to believe that there isn't an influence of pi in here.
Maybe. I will say my number is higher than that now, but this was at the time of my conversion. And apparently, so in terms of the decimals, I've been scolded by a mathematician, atheist named Anthony 66, based on some technicality. Because my inputs don't have any decimals, it's a faux pas, apparently, to put in decimals in the answer. But all I know is when I plugged in the numbers in the calculator, I got decimals. So I arbitrarily rounded to 2. If that's wrong, okay. 53%, then, whatever works.
Oh my.
That's with funny. Dale's. I didn't see what they said, but
let's see. It says I'm reading about this ridiculous prophecy, and every point is completely ad hoc assertion and reeks of makey-uppy time.
Okay.
I don't know if Nitty did say earlier he was going to download the PDF, so maybe he's reading through it.
Okay. I don't know. Fair enough.
And then James has a huge problem with Dale's view that because he judges and assumes that all the people in different sects and religions are, quote, not reasonable and not sincere, unquote, it's unfair, untrue, and ugly.
I don't necessarily assume that, right? So I think that there could be real seekers in other religions and that sort of thing, and even possibly reasonable real seekers. So for example, I think I fulfilled the criteria for being a reasonable real seeker. I can explain that if you want, but what I mean by that. But for years, God didn't reveal to me that Christianity was true, and so in a sense, I was in another religion, just the religion of general theism, kind of thing, right?
Oh,
So God, there is this other aspect where it's if you are a reasonable real seeker, and you detect these religion authenticating events. Sorry, if you're a real seeker, let's say, God's responsibility is to reveal to you the truth before the point of no return, before that point where your lack of knowledge of the truth would prevent you from achieving your ultimate purpose in creation. Um, so there is that aspect. I do think that can be reasonable real seekers in other religions, and God just hasn't revealed the truth to them because it hasn't arrived to the point of no return for them. That said, perhaps I am a little arrogant in that I do think that there are not a heck of a lot of reasonable real seekers. Most people in this world are not. It is a very hard standard to live up to. And even I myself struggle at times to, am I really? It's easy to say, oh, I'm open to evidence and stuff. Everybody says that, but sometimes it's BS and stuff. And I myself was tested back in 2017 because it looked like Islam was going to come true, as opposed to Christianity. There's a couple months where it was looking to me based on the evidence Islam's true, and I didn't like that. I had an emotional reaction. It hurt my friends and family and stuff like that, who were hoping I would come back to the Christian faith and stuff. But I was tested, like, hey, do I really mean this? Am I actually open-minded and willing, seeking the truth and willing to follow it? And I said, at the end of the day, the heck of all that. If it comes out in my third and final round that Islam's true, I'm going to become a Muslim because I'm interested in religious truth. So I have to follow that. So I would just say that it's a constant struggle to be a reasonable real seeker. Everybody says they're open to evidence. Most of it is BS for most people, I think. So perhaps I'm a little arrogant on that front.
I think it's an accurate statement for me. I mean, anything that's in the Bible, I've thoroughly investigated. I think I've read nearly everything with the church fathers. I believe I've read or have knowledge of most of the Old Testament stuff, and I have dyslexia, so a lot of times the reason I have the audio, this set to audio is because sometimes I don't understand it when I read it. I don't comprehend it. So I have these audio programs that allow me to convert it to audio, and I can read and listen to it at the same time, and that helps.
Mhm.
So, in effect, a lot of these things you can see once you get this level of knowledge. You can clearly see that. You can clearly see, at least in my opinion, you can see an evolution of all of this stuff. There isn't anything that looks like it came from a supernatural being. It looks like it came from a story. Somebody weaponized that story. That weaponization got old, and whatever the current disaster is, say for instance, California in the last 48 hours, that's God punishing us. You better listen to me. And they reiterate and maybe modernize the same type of repetitious command of people, either for power, for money, for influence, for popularity. Whatever the reason is, you see through the marching of time that continuation. And you see Judaism pretty much born out of Babylonian occupation type of thing. You see Egyptian occupation. You see influences come from a couple different religions, the stories of their god, a reinterpretation of their god. A Christian came out of Jewish beliefs. You see a similarity to the Islam nature coming from Christian and Jewish and Zoroastrianism, if I remember correctly. You
Well,
see kind of a conversion of those things all marrying together. You see influences of all of these religions to modernized philosophies, modernized storytelling mechanisms, and the way it works is this, in my opinion, this mental capturing, either of the imagination, or I also refer to it as joining in the um, sheep and the goats. Now, a lot of times the sheep and the goats is referenced as the believer, non-believer, but I think it's the two styles of Christianity. There is the peaceful, come unto me, I am the shepherd, I will lead you. And there's the, which I was raised in, the second one, the goat, I refer to this as the goat, is the browbeating style of you're going to hell, you have to do it this way. A lifetime, eternity of punishment awaits if you don't do it the way we
okay.
told you to do it.
Can I ask two follow-up questions? Because I didn't even
Yeah,
address
please.
this evolution thing at all, but
Yeah.
I wanted to challenge you a bit on it. So number one, okay, so you claim you're a reasonable real seeker on these specific matter of the evolution. One of the things is you said that Israel, the Bible, copied these ancient Babylonian myths and stuff. So, for example, the flood, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh and that sort of thing.
Right.
Just so I know, did you also seriously consider the other side of this argument? Because, like, what scholars are saying on the other side of this issue, like, what is the counter response to this? Did you study it at all?
It's my understanding that the Sumerians and the Babylonians had these stories prior to Hebrew. I believe, and the video that you may have watched from me, it kind of touches on how the progression of Genesis 1 through 11 begins and ends, and you see the evolution continue, I believe, from some of the Babylonian and the Sumerian texts. And I also believe that they have learned a lesson on how to create propaganda against the Canaanites. Let's just say that there was an enslavement of people who had a religious belief. They bestowed this religious belief to make these slaves more productive, make them happy slaves instead of angry, roughed up, beaten up slaves. And it worked. But it's also, the collective that united we stand type of collective that these slaves also overcame the slavery, right?
Okay.
And then they went and found their own slaves. And the Canaanites, the propaganda that contains within Genesis 5 and Genesis 9 specifically, is ever present. And you see the evolution of this enslavement type of story. And I think you see that evolution throughout the history of other religions, not just the Christian religions, but some of the Christian Gnostic religions. You see this type of thought process.
Mhm.
You see many other religions, even today. You see, just about anything that's regarded as a cult anymore. It has somebody who's a charismatic leader says, I am the next Messiah. I specifically pick on Warren Jeffs and the fundamental Latter-day Saints in the in the modern day equivalency. You see those through the through time. The history books haven't written about all of them, but you see a few of them, and you see how the Messiah story matures over and over again. The false prophet that we would consider Warren Jeffs to be, that matured over and over again. But the power and the control and the money and the influence that he was capable of doing for New Zion, all for the glory of this returned Messiah, etc., etc. And you see how it captivates the mind, and it works. And I think you see that in Genesis 1 through 11, and I think you see it through the entirety of the New Testament as a whole story. No supernatural being needed. Just somebody who figured it out and then either perpetuated it upon the people so that they could gain that influence, knowledge, and power. Or share it like I have and say, hey, let's stop this trend. Let's be good to mankind. This sucks. So to say that I am a real seeker, I am a real seeker. The problem is what I found wasn't that there was this almighty God and I'm going to resist him. It's that I found human evolution of storytelling and control. And it can be passed on to our generations, and we could put a stop to it. If you believe that you are on the right path with 53.14%, well, and it's true, and you figure out it's true, and you share that evidence with me, and I see it's true, I'm on your side. I'm in the 53.14, maybe even more. But that's not what I see. When I looked, I found something else. When I had my theophany, I found an expansion of the mind that showed it even further, where it's hidden. Where it's hidden within our holy book. It's not holy anymore. And there's nobody there who's coming for your soul, and there's nobody there who's going to correct the record as you insist that there is, in my opinion. That's who I'm seeking. Now that's who I'm seeking.
Gotcha. Perfect.
Thanks for listening to that. That was quite a...
No problem. No, I asked you a question, so I sincerely want your answers and stuff. And obviously, I was going to make the point, like when I looked at ancient Near Eastern scholars, there's a lot more nebulousness about this causal thesis and stuff. But there are times when we can actually prove it. And believe it or not, it's the opposite. The Babylonians, we know, copied the Bible, not the other way around. For example, with the specific element of the birds in Noah's flood. So I just wanted to ask you about that. But my second question for you comes from the New Testament, because this deals with the human factor, and I wanted to get your take on this as well. Okay. So you mentioned, look, it's all from surrounding influences and stuff like that. There's nothing that indicates something unique or special that is divine input. Now, N.T. Wright has argued for what he calls these 7 mutations in the New Testament. So a couple examples, just so you know what he's talking about there. For example, having Sunday as the day of worship as opposed to Saturday. Well, that's totally unique. That's a mutation for Christians. Also, believing Jesus rose from the dead as an individual before the general resurrection. There's nothing in the surrounding cultures that would indicate that. That's a novel input. So I just wanted to know, like, if you're aware of the 7 mutations and stuff like that, how do you explain that? Because that doesn't appear to just be borrowed from surrounding pagan or Jewish cultures and stuff.
I mean, does that... I guess I would give it some forethought if I considered any variation of the supernatural being the story came from. I also don't believe that Saturday was any different in the first century. I believe that occurred in the 2nd century as a further movement away from Jewish thinking. I think until somewhere around 250 to 260, the Jewish beliefs and the Christian beliefs were very much intermingled, and were starting to separate more and more, as the Romans considered the Christian more affluent than the Jewish in their, I don't want to say rebel, but in their, a government. To me, it looked like the Roman Empire saw Christianity in the mid 3rd century as a disgusting lie, and they barely even recognized it as anything prior to that. There were a few moments, but basically the pagan gods were their gods, and this whatever this influence of this Christ guy, so be it half the time. And then every once in a while, some political flare-ups would occur, and just like the Jews were blamed for the fire under Nero, if there was a scapegoat needed, or if there was some variation of, in today's politics, we see that's the enemy, let's go after them, then you kind of have the similar situation there. But as for seeing a Friday at sundown to Saturday versus we're going to meet on Sunday, I don't think that there was until later in the Christian movement that happened. I don't believe there's a moment where anybody say, "Hey, we need to start meeting on this day." I think it was just as much political influence, from what little I know, as it was for religious inheritance from a supernatural being.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right, cool. Yeah, just like I said, I just wanted to ask those sincere questions. So yeah, thanks
Is
for your answers.
is the Saturday movement, like what would your Saturday movement, how does that contribute to the 553.14?
So for me, I guess it didn't. Well, yeah, the Sunday thing itself didn't play a role for me specifically. It was part of the evidence I looked at. So obviously, biblical scholars and N.T. Wright, they've done the work to argue historically that no, this was a very early invention. So they would disagree with you saying it came about only later on in the second century and that sort of thing. They argued that this was one of the earliest innovations, and because of that taking place in the Jewish context, it's remarkable. In terms of how that translated for me personally into anything contributing to the 53.14, it didn't, because the only thing I had was the appearance to the 12, and I don't think the Sunday worship, apart from maybe like a general reliability thing or something, like just general saying like, hey, something remarkable happened. I don't think it really played a role for me specifically. The role it plays for N.T. Wright in his argument is because he's arguing for the resurrection on the basis of the origin of the Christian belief, and he's saying, well, that requires Jesus must have probably rose from the dead, or at the very least requires certain facts. So that's how he uses these mutations. But I didn't make that argument from the origin of the Christian belief. So because of that, the Sunday thing played little to no role for me. Yeah. Oh, are you frozen? Or?
So
Oh, there.
let me pull up. Let's get him. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna.
But hopefully did that make sense at all? Or
Yeah, let's do this.
In the New Testament scriptures.
I don't know if I like this music in the background.
if you're trying to show the video, I'm still in the big. Okay, there you go.
So he reads from
Into death,
Romans 6,
so that
1:14.
just as the Messiah was raised from the dead through the Father's glory, we too might behave with a new quality of life. That remarkable passage is where Paul finds himself, where we find ourselves at this particular moment in the church's year, buried with the Messiah, when Jesus was buried on the evening.
So this is where he's saying that the Saturday conversion, Jewish tradition, converts to Sunday because he was. I mean, this is basically geared towards Easter, yeah.
I guess so. Yeah, like I haven't seen
of Good
video, but
Friday, and then through what we call Holy Saturday. It's a time of waiting. What's going on? And Paul is unpacking that and saying, we were buried with him, and that means that we have to regard ourselves as having died with him and then being left behind in the tomb so that when he is raised, we might be raised as well. Paul isn't just...
So here's, I guess, what is your, before you go any further, what is your interpretation of Romans, for instance?
Of Romans as just...
It's the book, yeah. Because, like, I've heard multiple different things, what its legitimacy is, who wrote it. It is disputed that Paul wrote it somewhat. It's also been... it's my understanding that Romans is a sermon that Paul would have delivered, more or less, but that it was possibly written by Luke. I've also heard that as well, that it's not really a letter to the Romans. It's more of a sermon that was presented on a regular basis.
So no, I've heard the opposite. I definitely side with the majority of biblical scholars in saying that Paul definitely wrote this, and it was a letter. It was something. This is probably his masterpiece of a letter where he this was way more involved than his just local preaching and stuff like that. This is where he kind of sets out his major theological doctrines in a very structured manner and stuff, whereas his other letters are more occasional letters and stuff like that, written to the Corinthians because, hey, I'm hearing about these problems, let me get into this. This is more of Romans above everything is kind of like, hey, I want to write theology here and tell you what the proper doctrines are and stuff like that. So that's what I've heard in terms of the general info about what Romans is about and stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely pulling it to 57 CE. Just popped up an ad. So.
Mm-hmm. If there on Bible.org, Dan Wallace, he's a biblical scholar as well. He's got, for all of the New Testament books at least, he's got like very detailed info about the author, dating of books, how and why we date it, what's the theme, so general info like that for every New Testament book. If you guys are interested in that.
Yeah.
Talking about what's going to happen when we are raised in the future, when Jesus comes again. There is a new resurrection which happens already when somebody, through baptism and faith, comes into the family in which suddenly new life makes sense, and it means us. We have to be that sort of people. Paul is here warning against a very familiar misinterpretation of the gospel of grace, that when people really hear that God loves us so much that he came to give his own son to die for us, they often think, oh, well, that's amazing. So whatever I do now, it really doesn't matter because Jesus has died for me, so all's going to be well.
So, yeah, I don't know if this, to me anyway, Dale, this looks and sounds like good storytelling. This doesn't have, there's zero gravitas behind this for me.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like, again, his purpose in this video is different than when he was talking about, like, I'm referencing his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God. He did do a documentary with BBC that was available on YouTube. It was like a 1 hour thing outlining his entire thesis, but I've tried to find it since, and it looks like it's gone. But
that would be copyright claim city.
Oh yeah. BBC is horrible. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, BBC.
But the point that again, I don't make this argument, but the point, I can't remember. He provides his evidence for it. I can't remember it because this was years ago, and like I said, I don't use it personally. But he was trying to establish, look, the origin of the Christian belief probably requires a supernatural resurrection of Jesus by God, because number one, how do you explain these remarkable innovations, or what he calls mutations, of the Christian belief versus the Jewish and pagan belief? And his first 200 pages in that book is like devoted to what are all the pagan beliefs at the time, what are all the Jewish beliefs at the time from the late Second Temple period, 200 years plus or minus the time of Jesus. And Christianity is entirely unique. So that's what, including this Sunday thing. And then he uses these as a reason to go, well, you should believe in the resurrection, to explain the origin of these beliefs.
Yeah. Well, keep in mind, if Paul is writing and delivering a sermon and writing it down and sending it to a church, to me, this is schismmanship. It isn't legitimate, and it could be good storytelling that was learned from somebody else who is a good storyteller. Just like I believe N.T. Wright is probably going to be a learned storyteller from someplace else. To use my earlier Lucasfilm, the reason we have all these consecutive Star Wars films is because of the interest and the popularity and the, as soon as you look at all the fingers from what got the Star Wars franchise going to all the fingers afterwards through Skywalker Sound and Industrial Light and Magic and all the DreamWorks and Pixar and influences from Lucasfilm in the first place. If I had to tell you the complexity of that without a schematic, it would be impossible. And it's the same thing with the entertainment of the day of the first century of Paul's apocalyptic preacher's trope.
Well, Paul wasn't completely unrestrained, right? I mean, he even in his own letters, he talks about the Jerusalem apostles and how they confirm what he says, and he even deals with thorns in his side from Jerusalem who are contradicting him and stuff, who are false prophets and that sort of thing. So, like, there were checks and balances, right? There were living eyewitnesses who, if Paul was just totally making up his own thing, he would have been caught. Very soon, right after, because it was a very connected early church community, right? And they had, at least in the first century, before the destruction of the Second Temple, they had very strong connections and authority from the Jerusalem apostles who would have said, "What are you talking about, Paul? That's complete BS. No, we Jesus never said that, or we never taught this, or we're totally against what you're saying." So, like, I just don't think it's the model that you're what did you call it? Scissorship or
Sizzlemanship.
sizzlemanship. Yeah.
Yes, it is a version of salesmanship in which you're selling all of the sizzle and not the steak.
Oh, I see. Okay, makes sense.
It's
yeah.
a term. It's a term that a car salesman will tell you. Is an art form almost. So I wanted to make a point also that let's let NT write, but to kind of play on what you were saying, and I want to go back to my Warren Jeffs. Do you know who Warren Jeffs is? Have you ever?
Warren Jeffs?
Yeah.
No, I haven't heard of him.
So Warren Jeffs is a returned Messiah and the fundamental Latter-day Saint.
Okay.
He's sitting in prison right now in a federal penitentiary. Now, he is acclaimed. At one time, he had somewhere around 15,000 followers, maybe even more.
Yeah, and I have heard of him. He was in your video.
Yeah.
So yeah, I know.
I may have sent you. I don't remember if I don't think I sent you that video, but there's another video that I heavily storytell based on him.
Okay.
And the fact is, he wasn't taken down because he was a false Messiah or he was spreading the word about a false Messiah. He was taken down because of sexual assault. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So to say that Paul is going to get caught for all of this, yes, there were political uprisings, and the leaders of those political uprisings, whether they were true and honest or false, they got taken care of. John the Baptist was a political hit. Jesus was a political hit, not a religious one. And James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, that was a political hit. It wasn't because of their beliefs. In my opinion, it was because they kind of have some control of the people and they were getting a little too big for their britches.
So, like, what? Because, like, James and them ended up agreeing with Paul and confirming his message. So what do you mean? It was a political hit on the Judaizers or something, like
when they were murdered, when they were killed by the Romans.
Oh, okay. Who was killed by the Romans? What, like, you mean Paul and
John the Baptist, Jesus, and James the Just.
Okay. Yeah, well, James, I think, was killed by the Jews, but yeah, like, I totally agree with you that, yeah, it was politically motivated. Like, Jesus' death was pure politics, from the Romans' perspective, right? They didn't take the religious claims of the Jews, let alone the specific sects within Judaism, seriously. So I do agree with that explains why the Romans would have executed people. Same with the Jewish authorities going after James, or persecuting Paul. I mean, it was the Jews who took him to the Romans when Paul came back to Jerusalem that got him arrested, that ultimately wound up in Rome to get killed, right? But I don't see why, like, so I guess I'm just asking, so what? Like, their motivations don't say anything about the truth or falsity of Paul's message.
it's just to counter the point that you had made that if Paul would have gotten caught if this stuff wasn't true. And I don't believe that's accurate. I think Paul was getting caught for political reasons, not because of what he was saying on a Saturday or Sunday or a confliction between Saturday and Sunday.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's true. So when I said getting caught, though, I was specifically meant getting caught by the Jerusalem apostles. That's what and I don't think that was political.
And to counter that point, I think the reason that Paul really loved his position as this forebearer is because of the Jerusalem donation. He realized the monetary power he possessed. And that was a motivator.
So that's why they accepted him, you're saying? Or
Yeah, he was bringing the fat coin. This new Roman coin instead of this sacrificial lambs, We don't need to feed the hungry by donating our best animal anymore. We can just get this coin.
Okay. Well, that sounds plausible. Obviously, I would argue. I think it's improbable given the strength. We would get into the evidence. You've heard of the claims that, look, their Jews' religious beliefs, especially for James, who was a very strong conservative Jew, right? He kind of cherished the law and that sort of thing, whereas Paul was more, let's be free of it, before they came to their compromise. So I just think it's unlikely, let me say, that would have been the reason. They would be like, James and the Jerusalem apostles would be like, yeah, Paul, cool. You give us money, you can preach whatever you want. I just don't think that's likely given the evidence we have from them, especially since we know they were willing to suffer and in some cases die, such as James, the son of Zebedee. It doesn't seem likely to me that that's the reason, if that makes sense.
Let's go on with NT right here.
Whatever I do. And Paul says, how can you possibly think like that? The whole point of the Jesus story is that we share. If we are in Christ, the phrase Paul uses again and again, if we are in Christ, then what happened to Jesus happened to us. And so this whole chapter unfolds as the Easter message saying, now, start one more time with the story. We are with him in the tomb, and now we are raised from the dead. That's how we discover what it means to be Easter people, that as he was raised from the dead, we too should be people who have a new kind of life. And this question of status isn't a matter of, well, I feel like this today, or I behaved like this yesterday.
So, I don't know where he's going with this, but
he's just explaining.
Do you know what he's going?
Yeah, he's basically just explaining, like, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but he's talking about what it means to be born again, like to die in baptism and then to be raised again as a new person in Christ. That's all he's talking about here, kind of thing. It's analogous to the resurrection that Jesus had.
Do you think? Do you think that if it's true, is selling how the steak sitting on the grill is sizzling away and describing the aroma and describing how juicy and the miscellaneous plumes of steam and smoke kind of mixed together? To me, that is what he's doing. That is sizzlemanship, describing what's going on the grill instead of showing us. And that is a deceiver's tool. Never letting you get to that steak. Always describing how wonderful it's going to be when you finally get to have it. And to me, this is where the deception is perpetuated.
I can agree in a certain sense that I agree with you that he's not showing anything. He's just describing, right? He's giving a series of statements and that sort of thing. But I think that you're being unfair in ascribing some kind of malicious thing where he's sizzling. No, he's not, because he's not the purpose of the video is expository. He's just expositing what is the meaning of Romans chapter 6 verses 1 to thing. So I think that you're being uncharitable to his purposes. Like, there's nothing wrong with making a video just describing or explaining what our beliefs are or what a certain thing is. Where the problem would come in is if you're just describing and then you're trying to sell that as though, well, this is a reason you should believe. Like, I believe in hell, therefore you should believe, kind of thing, right? That would be more of a underhanded tactic. But I didn't see N.T. Wright doing that. He's just giving a Bible lesson. He's just expositing what Romans means there.
I do, but I also believe that this is good salesmanship. This is just good description on something that's there. It's elaborated to probably a greater point than it ever would have been in the first century. I don't think there's an equivalent to today that I would accept what he's saying if it happened 20 years ago, just the same as if it happened 1970 years ago, right?
Okay, so maybe the fault's mine. I misunderstood what sizzlemanship is. So you're saying sizzlemanship can apply even if he's just describing. He's kind of selling, I don't know, selling it, but like trying to explain it in ways that aren't, in your opinion, true to what the original text was, or something like that. Or
yeah, it's probably been elaborated or maybe legendized a touch. Easter. Tell me that in 55 AD, Common Era, tell me what Easter was like at anybody's house, Easter Sunday in 55, under Paul's church network. Yeah. Was it anything compared to what he's sitting in a gorgeous setting and explaining to us? And I seriously doubt it.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that Easter was celebrated totally differently and stuff like that, or it didn't even exist as a holiday, certainly in the first century and stuff like that. I think that I don't think he's sizzling in terms of expositing those specific verses, that this was a first century Christian understanding of, the symbolism of dying and rising again, being born again. He's totally accurate to the first century on that front. But I would agree with you that, yeah, if he was talking about celebrating Easter and mentioning certain things like we have today, that's totally disanalogous to how they would have celebrated Jesus' resurrection back in the first century. For starters, there wouldn't have been Easter as a day at all, right? So, yeah, I agree with you.
Let's go back to your comment here.
Okay.
Included a cumulative 95% credence that Christianity is false based on the negative evidences. Combined meaning.
So on the 95%, Christianity is false. So the 4 sections that you had previously mentioned.
Yep. The negative.
Off of those 4, there's a 95% chance that Christianity is false. In the law of averages, correct?
Yep. So that's what I would.
So a 1 in 20 shot. We got this 1 in 20. That's the odds that God's going for. 1 in 20.
Well, yeah, based in isolating out the negative evidences. And again, this was a worst case scenario on my part. I kind of just cheated against Christianity because I knew I had a bias about that, right? So I went with the worst thing. I gave a 5% possibility that Christianity is true, given the negative evidences. But then you factor in the positive evidences, and those were so strong it overwhelmed that and made it more probable than not, all evidences combined, that Christianity is true. But yeah, so the 95% was me giving kind of cheating against Christianity and saying that the heck with even my true values on the negative evidences. I'm just going to assume the worst case. 95% for me is, there's always like a plus or minus. So I arbitrarily picked 5% as my standard deviation, right? So that's why I picked 95%, because that's the maximum hit that you could do to falsify Christianity on the negative evidences. William Lane Craig is full of it on this front. I love William Lane Craig. He's my hero. He, like I said in the show last night, he saved my life with Molinism. But he's totally wrong. He's advocating for a thing called pragmatic encroachment theory, or at least it seems like that's what he's advocating for in these statements. Whether he actually believes that or not, I don't know. But yeah, so he's basically saying, look, that in terms of the evidences, right? So I came out overall positive and negative evidences 53.14 at the time of my conversion. So if I was following evidentialism, which I am, okay, you believe Christianity is true. Pragmatic encroachment theory says, well, no, you also have to factor in not just the evidence, but the pragmatic stakes that are involved, right? Like, hey, what are the costs of not believing something or the benefits of not believing something versus the costs and benefits of believing it? And on that front, that can lower. So William Lane Craig is saying that should lower. Look, the benefits, if you believe Christianity, you're going to heaven, and the costs, you're going to hell if you disbelieve. So based on that, he's saying, like, look, if you're just 1% convinced, that's good enough. You should believe in Christianity based on, if you only have 1% evidence, that's all you need. I think that's totally BS. That is wrong. No, we based on the evidence. On the flip side, though, I hear atheists and skeptics all the time arguing just as stupidly as William Lane Craig here when they say, well, look, the costs and practical costs and benefits of believing in Christianity are so great that this raises the evidential sufficiency threshold. I won't believe until Christianity is proven beyond all reasonable doubt, or with absolute certainty. I need 95% proof or 100% proof before I'll believe in Christianity. That's just as stupid, in my opinion, and it's because I reject this pragmatic encroachment theory in epistemology.
Yeah, I as an atheist get quite a bit of joy listening to Mr. Deity, YouTuber Mr. Deity, pick apart and basically catchphrase Low Bar Bill for his comments on that thing.
Yeah, well, he did a show explaining it. I didn't see it all, so maybe being trying to be charitable to him, maybe he's explained it where his words are being. He didn't say what he means, but if he means that, then
Yeah,
I just
think
disagree with
the
that theory.
best video as an atheist anyway, the best video I've seen picking apart the argument from Bill here is from a YouTube creator called Non-Alchemist.
Non-what?
Non-Alchemist.
Okay, yep, I know of them.
And you know what? I'll try to leave that in the description. A link to that one. That one is it's a little bit of a jab, but it's also a nice, quick breakdown of some of the hard facts behind the statement, and I appreciate it very much. The way that
he did it.
The way he did it is phenomenal. What he can do in 4 minutes takes me 2 hours to say. I don't know. I don't understand it. Dyslexia.
Yeah.
I blame it on God.
Or yourself. I have the same problem. I've been told I'm verbose at times, or I got to work on being concise.
Yeah.
And stuff like that, so I can relate. But.
All right, let's finish this up. I think we've only got about 10, 15 more seconds to go.
There was merely a 5% probability that Christianity was true before I even looked at the 4 positive evidences. Thankfully, the evidence was so powerful on the positive side. Cumulatively, it overwhelmed the extremely low likelihood of falsehood based on the negative evidences. 0 likes. Gmail.
What? Gmail? So,
No.
I just love the way it said cumulatively. Cumulatively. That was good.
Yes. She's my girlfriend. I love her. If it weren't for her, I would be stupid.
Lovely voice, I have to say. So.
Yeah. She's a little robotic. Hey, I think I can choose something else, but I don't remember. It's been a while since I've gotten used to her.
Yeah. You did.
She mispronounces it. Like, it's very difficult for her to tell the difference whether she should be saying live or live. I think it's funny.
Yeah. Well, hey, I confuse those two myself. So.
Yeah, I know. So yeah.
Tears from the Moon.
Yeah, that's a great song that it obviously knows that I like.
Mhm.
that the remix was done by Sinead O'Connor.
Oh wow.
But I'm sure I would get a copyright strike if I played that.
Yeah, these stupid copyrights, man.
Yeah.
I've had a few videos taken down because of that. So yeah.
I had one that I had to really slice and dice off like 15 minutes worth of stuff off, but was able to save it. I finally got it to stick. It's still marked copyright, but it's not blocked.
Gotcha.
So,
That's good then. Yeah, as long as you're getting it out there, something, then that's good enough.
yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, I was gonna give you the last word on the, because you also, it sounds like, bracketed 4 Christian best evidences cumulatively. So I was gonna give you the last word, and then I was gonna go into my bloody Jesus shtick and moment of Zen, and then we're gonna close out the show.
All right, cool. So, all right, cool. So, in terms of the 4 positive evidences that convinced me at the time of my conversion, so I've already kind of listed them out, but yeah. So the first one would be the historical evidence for the resurrection. So this is stuff that you see all the time from people like William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas, Sean McDowell, Mike Lacona, all those good guys. For me specifically, though, even though I accept most or if not all of the historical facts that they do, I think at the explanatory level, only one of those facts is relevant towards proving that a miracle happened, and that's the appearance to the 12. And I have a couple arguments on that front. I think my subjective probability on that front was about between 57 to 59% for that specific evidential factor. And secondly is also the Shroud of Turin, which I know you didn't want Jimmy here didn't want to talk about too much, but I think that the formation of the images also qualifies as a religion authenticating miracle. And I've evaluated all of the scientific hypotheses to try and explain them. They all, in one way or the other, fail to explain one of the physical and or chemical properties of those images. Thirdly, I have what's called the vindication prediction argument, which is essentially an argument where someone might accuse me of double dipping, but I think it provides double warrant. So essentially, it says, look, we can prove historically Jesus predicted his own vindication via miraculous means. And because we can prove the shroud and the historical evidence for the appearance of the 12 are miraculous events, then we can say, well, the prediction itself was also a religion authenticating miracle too, because I don't believe in those kinds of coincidences that he just happens to predict that he'd be vindicated, and then just randomly God raises him from the dead and appears to the 12 and also appears to thing. No, it just makes more sense that that prediction itself was given by God. It was miraculous in some way as well. And then finally, this is not an objective evidence, but the fourth factor is a properly basic belief in through the inner witness of the Holy Spirit, giving me testimony to my spirit about the truth of Christianity directly. So that's a subjective evidence, but subjective evidences can provide a warranted true belief, which equals knowledge. So those are the 4 factors for me in a nutshell.
All right, that sounds good. Well, let's get this party finished.
Let's do it.
It was a good time, hopefully had by all.
Definitely.
And,
yep. I enjoyed it.
be weary of your free gift of salvation. It is lurking on the other side of every scripture verse, and potentially deception hiding everywhere. Don't fall for it. Bloody Jesus, he is in the world, and he gave. Gave means bloody Jesus. Bloody Jesus means that God gave his only begotten Son First of all, I don't think God can only have one son, and I certainly don't think that he has to murder him to make his point. If God hugged his son instead, bloody Jesus wouldn't be an evil so evil it's seen as good. Dale, thank you very much for your participation today in the conversation on our live stream. It was quite an enjoyable podcast. We had quite a bit of activity in the chat.
Oh, wow.
And
Awesome. Hopefully not too negative about me, but
none whatsoever. This is how it works. If we are successful in continuing humanity without Christianity, atheism and Christianity and other Abrahamic beliefs have to treat each other like we're in a marriage instead of a divorce.
Well said.
So
Awesome.
that is my intention from the get-go of starting my channel, is let's try to work this out. I think we have a disagreement, and I would like to see us go forward with facts and not whatever the Christian Bible represents as potentially deception. So thank you all for tuning in. Here is your moment of Zen. Oh, shoot. No, I'm not sharing it. That's a fail. This is why I never have nice things. There we go.
Go to Marshall's today?
Yeah, we can go after I finish this. I don't care. I just gotta finish this up, though. Jimmy, thank you, baby.
Oh my god, you are so beautiful.
Aw, thanks. See, somebody appreciates me.
I've seen this.
What the hell, Jimmy?
She is one lucky girl.
I've seen this clip, yeah.
Thank you, Jimmy.